Welcome to Scripture Unveiled. Today, we're journeying back to a time just before the Great Flood, to a world teetering on the edge of divine judgment. Tucked away in the opening chapters of Genesis is this short, almost cryptic account that has puzzled scholars, theologians, and frankly, anyone who's read it for thousands of years. It's a story that hints at strange unions, powerful heroes, and a society spiraling into a chaos so deep it actually moved the heart of God to grief. We are talking, of course, about the Nephilim. And here it is. This is the verse that has launched 1,000 debates. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. In just these few lines, we meet three really mysterious groups. You've got the sons of God, the daughters of humans, and then their children, the Nephilim, who are called the heroes of old, men of renown. So what are we looking at here? Are these the offspring of fallen angels and human women, like some ancient traditions say? Or is this about a forbidden marriage between two different human families? Or could it be something else entirely? To really figure this out, we have to look a lot closer at the text itself. So this is it. This is the central question for us today. Who, or maybe what, were the Nephilim? And why is their story the final, terrible example of a world so broken that God would choose to judge it with a catastrophic flood? To find the answer, we really have to become biblical detectives. We're going to have to dig into the original Hebrew, place this story in its proper ancient context, and try to uncover the profound theological message the author of Genesis was trying to get across, not just to his original audience, but to us as well. So here's our game plan. We're going to tackle this in 6 parts. We'll start by setting the scene, looking at the context of this pre-flood mystery. Then we'll dive in and unpack the 3 major theories about what was going on. After that, we'll look at how this story connects with other ancient myths and talk about what it means to read Scripture faithfully. All of that will lead us to a proposed resolution, one that really zeroes in on the idea of systemic violence. And finally, we'll talk about the deep theological meaning this ancient story still has for us today. First things first, context is absolutely everything. The placement of this story is no accident. The author of Genesis puts this account of the Nephilim right before God declares his heartbreak over humanity. In the very next verse, it says that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. So you see, the story of the Nephilim isn't just some weird mythological detour. It's being presented as the final straw, the culminating proof of a corruption so deep that it called for the decreation and recreation of the world. The whole thing starts with a progression that sounds eerily familiar, a lot like the fall in Genesis 3. It says the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, which echoes how Eve saw that the fruit was good for food. And then they took for themselves wives. The text is very specific, any of them they chose. Now that language doesn't suggest a loving partnership, does it? It sounds like acquisition, like coercion. It's a complete violation of God's design for marriage. The entire mystery really hinges on figuring out who these 2 groups are. Okay, so our first clue is this Hebrew phrase, B'nai Ha-Elohim. Literally, it means sons of God. But here's the problem. It's a pretty rare term in the Old Testament. For example, over in the book of Job, the B'nai Ha-Elohim show up in the heavenly court, which strongly suggests they're angels. But then you look at a place like Psalm 82, where God judges the gods or sons of the Most High, and a lot of scholars think that's actually talking about corrupt human kings being held accountable for their injustice. So right from the get-go, we've got a major ambiguity. Are we talking about divine beings or really powerful humans? And that brings us to the kids, the Nephilim. Their name is a huge clue. It comes from the Hebrew root word nephal, which means to fall. Because of this, a lot of people translate their name as the fallen ones. Now, this falling could mean a spiritual fall, like a fall from grace. Or it could be more active, like they were the ones who fall upon others, like attackers or tyrants. The popular translation, giants, actually comes from the Septuagint, the ancient Greek version of the text, which used the word gigantes. And while they might have been big guys, the original Hebrew seems to point more to their character, that they were a generation defined by their violent fall into corruption. All right, so with those key terms and their built-in mysteries in mind, now we can really start to explore the 3 major interpretations that have developed over the centuries to try and solve this puzzle. Each one paints a very different picture of what happened and a different kind of sin that led the world into total chaos. So historically, you basically have 3 main camps. First, there's the Sethite view, which sees this whole thing as a human drama between 2 family lines. Then you have the angelic view, which is probably the most famous one, this idea of a supernatural union between angels and human women. And finally, there's the royalty view, which argues that what we're actually reading about is tyrannical kings abusing their God-given power. So let's take a look at the strengths and weaknesses of each one.
The Sethite view was really popular with early church fathers like Augustine. It suggests that this is a story about two human lineages. The sons of God are the good guys, the righteous descendants of Adam's son Seth, and the daughters of humans are the descendants of the corrupt line of Cain. So the big sim here is spiritual compromise, the godly family intermarrying with the ungodly, which blurs the lines between the faithful and the world. The upside of this view is that it avoids any supernatural weirdness and keeps the story grounded in human moral failure. But it has some pretty big weaknesses. The text itself never calls them the line of Seth or the line of Cain. It feels like an interpretation that's kind of forced onto the text, rather than one that flows naturally out of it.
Okay, next up is the angelic view. This is the oldest and, let's be honest, the most sensational interpretation. It's heavily influenced by ancient non-biblical texts like the Book of Enoch, and it claims that the sons of God were literally fallen angels who had children with human women, creating this hybrid race of giants. This view was super popular in the Second Temple period, and it even seems to get a nod in the New Testament. The Book of Jude, for instance, talks about angels who did not keep their proper domain, and a lot of people connect that right back to this event. But this view runs into a huge theological problem. In Matthew 22, Jesus himself says that angels in heaven neither marry nor are given in marriage. Now, you could argue these were fallen angels acting against their nature, but it still introduces this wild mythological element that just feels very different from the tone of the rest of Genesis.
So, that brings us to our third option, the royalty view. This interpretation has gained a ton of traction with modern scholars, and it argues that Sons of God was a common title for powerful kings back in the ancient Near East. Rulers in Egypt and Mesopotamia all the time claimed that they were divine to legitimize their power. So in this reading, the sin isn't supernatural, it's tragically human. It's the abuse of power. You have these powerful tyrants acting like they're gods who take any woman they want, probably by force, and they establish the first royal harems. This view fits perfectly with the pattern of sin we're already seeing in Genesis, especially with that violent boast from Lamech back in chapter 4, who takes 2 wives and brags about his murderous revenge. It's a story of political and social meltdown.
Now, to really get a handle on which of these views makes the most sense, we need to zoom out. We need to look at the world this text was born into, because the story in Genesis 6 didn't just appear out of nowhere. The ancient Near East was a world swimming in epic myths about creation, about fickle gods, and, you guessed it, about catastrophic floods. The biblical author wasn't writing on a blank slate. They were deliberately stepping into a very well-known cultural conversation. This timeline really puts it into perspective. You can see that flood stories were a staple of Mesopotamian literature long before Genesis was written down. The epics of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, for example, have these incredibly detailed accounts of a global flood sent by the gods. Now, the existence of these stories doesn't undermine the Bible at all. In fact, it does the opposite. It highlights just how unique the biblical account is. The author of Genesis knew these other stories, and in telling Israel's story, he was making a radical, subversive point against the pagan myths all around them. And the differences are just staggering. In the Mesopotamian myths, the flood happens because the gods are basically annoyed that humans are making too much noise. The gods are petty, they're impulsive, they squabble with each other. The hero only gets saved because one god tricks the others. Then you look at Genesis, and the contrast couldn't be more stark. The flood is a divine judgment, not against noise, but against a deep moral crisis, systemic violence and injustice. You have one sovereign, moral God who is genuinely grieved by human evil. And Noah isn't saved by a trick. He's invited into a covenant relationship. The goal isn't just survival, it's the purification and renewal of all creation. Understanding this historical backdrop is really the first step toward reading a text like this faithfully. When we come across strange, difficult passages like Genesis 6, our main goal shouldn't be to make it fit our 21st century ideas. Our job is to understand what the original author intended to communicate to his original audience, using the literary tools and cultural framework of his own time. Now, for many believers, a key principle here is biblical inerrancy. But it's important to understand what that actually means. It doesn't mean the Bible is a modern science textbook or that every single verse has to be read in a flat literalistic way. What it means is that the Bible is true and trustworthy in everything it intends to affirm. And the key part of that is understanding its original context. It's affirming deep theological and historical truths using the literary styles of its day, not art.
You know, this isn't a new idea. The great theologian Augustine of Hippo warned about this exact thing centuries ago. He basically said that it's dangerous to force absurd interpretations onto Scripture just for the sake of faith. If we misrepresent the Bible on things the world can actually observe and understand, why on earth would anyone trust its testimony on the spiritual things we can't see? A faithful reading has to be an intelligent reading.
Okay, so let's bring all these threads together. We've got the tricky Hebrew text, we've got the competing theories, we've got the ancient cultural context, and our commitment to reading the Bible faithfully. When we put all those pieces on the table, the royalty view really starts to emerge as the most powerful and coherent explanation for the moral chaos that was swallowing the pre-flood world. This interpretation shows us a tragic chain reaction. It all starts with the abuse of power, as these rulers who see themselves as gods just shatter the sacred institution of marriage, taking women by force. This, of course, leads to a profound social decay at the most basic level of society, the family. And out of this corruption, you get their offspring, the Nephilim, the fallen ones. They aren't supernatural hybrids. They're a generation of violent tyrants, the heroes of old, who are famous for their brute strength, not for their character. And this whole culture of might makes right ends with a world filled with the specific kind of evil the Bible calls Hamas. This Hebrew word, Hamas, is absolutely critical to understanding the whole story. In Genesis 6, verse 11, the text says, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence," Hamas. This isn't just talking about a few people getting angry. Hamas refers to systemic, institutionalized violence and injustice. It's oppression and exploitation that have been woven into the very fabric of a society from the top down. And what Genesis is arguing is that this systemic corruption is the direct, inevitable result of leaders who abuse their power and destroy the family.
So this is where we land. The story of the Nephilim is most likely not some mythological tale of angel-human monsters. It's actually a sophisticated and powerful theological critique of the pagan empires of the ancient world. The Nephilim, the fallen ones, were the brutal celebrity warriors of their day, the human embodiment of a tyrannical system built on the abuse of power, a system so thoroughly corrupt that it grieved the heart of God and called for the cleansing of all creation.
And this brings us to our final and really the most important question. Why does any of this matter today? What's the enduring theological message of this strange ancient story? Well, once we peel back all the layers of mythological speculation, we find a warning that is profoundly and eternally relevant. This short account teaches us, first, that sin is never just a private thing. It becomes systemic. It poisons cultures and institutions. It shows us that the abuse of power, especially sexual exploitation and the violation of human dignity, is a deep offense against God. And it reminds us that while God is a God of justice who confronts evil, he is also a God of grace who always preserves a remnant, like Noah and his family, to start again. In so many ways, this story really sets the stage for the rest of the Bible, which is God's long, unfolding answer to the problem of human Hamas.
And so we'll end with a question for you to think about. If the spirit of the Nephilim is a culture that celebrates power, violence, and fame over justice and righteousness, where do we see that spirit at work in our world today? In our politics, in our entertainment, our economies? The story of Genesis 6 is an ancient warning, but its echoes are all around us, challenging each of us to choose the way of Noah, the way of righteousness and faithfulness, over the way of the Nephilim. Thanks for joining us on Scripture Unveiled.